Hello, everyone from St. John's, Newfoundland and Labrador. My name is Andrea Warman, and I'm an Alumni Engagement Officer and your host for today's event. In this extremely difficult time in history, we're honored to have some of our very own to help guide Memorial's alumni and friends family through this situation in Eastern Europe. We feel lucky that our speakers are willing to share their knowledge, insight, and perspectives on war, educating us. And during times like these, educating ourselves is one of the best things that we can do. So I'm here with Doctors Lucian Ashworth, Russell Williams, and Isabelle Côté from Memorial University's Department of Political Science for a discussion on the war in Ukraine. We will begin today's event with a land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that the lands on which Memorial University's campuses are situated are in the traditional territories of diverse Indigenous groups, and we acknowledge with respect the histories and cultures of the Beothuk, Mi'kmaq, Innu, and Inuit of this province. We encourage everyone to reflect on these lands from where you are located and the Indigenous peoples for whom these lands are traditional territories. So thank you for joining us today for an important discussion. It is so difficult to make sense of the horrific, unjust events happening in Ukraine. With today's presentation, titled Making Sense of the War in Ukraine, we aim to inform our viewers and help gain some understanding of this complicated time. A brief Q&A will follow the presentation, and I will be monitoring the Q&A function, which you will see at the bottom right-hand side of your screen. So please try to keep your questions short, and I encourage you to post these early. Don't leave them to the last minute. We have a very full program and only limited time to take questions. You are not able to unmute your microphone or turn on your video, and you won't be able to see other people's messages in the chat. So we're streaming live, but the session is being recorded, and you will receive a link and a follow-up email. It is my great pleasure to officially introduce our special guests today in the order that they will be speaking. Dr. Lucian Ashworth is a professor in the Department of Political Science specializing in international relations. His main research area is international thought, although he is probably best known to his students for his third-year course on the global politics of the end of the world as we know it. Dr. Russell Allen Williams is an associate professor of political science at Memorial. His research focuses on the intersection between international political economy and public policy in the areas of financial services, regulation, the management of trade disputes, and climate change policy. He is a co-author of Making Governance Work: Policy Making in the Era of Polarized Politics. Dr. Isabelle Côté is an associate professor in the Department of Political Science at Memorial. She received her PhD in political science from the University of Toronto. She has published on international migration, ethnic conflict, and contentious politics in Asia and beyond. So with that, I am going to turn things over to Dr. Ashworth, and I will see you at the end. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Andrea. I'm going to give a quick rundown of the international relations of the crisis, and I'm going to start off by pointing out something that may be obvious, I think, to many of you. We're in uncharted waters, as I'll explain. And this is a crisis, and a crisis in the true meaning of the original sense of crisis, that it could really go either way. Anyone who can predict how this crisis is going to end up doesn't understand the situation. So what is it that I can tell you about this? Well, first of all, I think the basic point about what's gone on here is that a member of the United Nations has invaded another member of the United Nations without any direct provocation or with a United Nations Security Council resolution. And so it does fall under the definition from the UN Charter of an aggressive war. There's an added complication to this. One of the invader is a nuclear armed state. And of course, the prospect of nuclear war hasn't been far away from the crisis. It's only the Sunday before last where the president of Russia, Vladimir Putin, claimed to be putting his strategic arsenal on alert. And so the prospect of a return of an old threat that many of us had hoped had ceased to be a problem it sort of comes back into view. One of the reasons why this is not very predictable and wasn't really predicted by many experts is that the actions that have been taking place here aren't they're against Putin's modus operandi. Putin, in his foreign policy, has usually been heavily opportunistic, and when he's used the military, it's been limited to military so-called special operations. We've seen this in Chechnya, in Syria, and particularly in the war with Georgia in 2008. The other thing that is against his MO as well is that usually he's done a very good job of preparing the Russian government and the population of Russia for the decision. And there's very good evidence that the Russian government was taken by surprise on this, let alone the Russian population. And this is why many experts were caught by surprise. They were expecting Putin to be much more limited in his goals and limited to the Donbass region. And so this really is, in that extent, Putin's war. But of course, and this is where things get complicated, of course, is that Putin and his advisors seriously underestimated both the Ukrainian resistance and also the Western resolve. I think he was expecting the Ukrainian army to crumble, and also for the West to really give maybe a few token sanctions, but the sheer level of sanctions, which is something that my colleague Russell Williams will be dealing with in more detail, have been quite unprecedented. And it's also had the effect of uniting the West in a way that is really also unprecedented. The sight of Viktor Orban of Hungary backing sanctions, and also recently allowing NATO military to pass through Hungary is really, again, unprecedented. And especially, I think the really big change has been the German change in policy away from its classic post-war stance, which has been very defensive and very unmilitary. The other thing about it is that it's in the West, it's caught the Russian supporting Western far-right and populist movements on the back foot. And many of them have been spending the last 2 weeks trying to back away from their previous support for the Putin regime. So a combination of Russia's weakness, Ukrainian resistance, Western resolve, global reaction. We saw the United Nations resolution in the General Assembly, and also Central and Eastern European reactions, amongst other Central and Eastern European states, against Putin, really, I think suggests that this is a severe misjudgment by Putin. I maybe would go as far to use the colloquial expression that he has probably drunk his own Kool-Aid. So what does Putin want? And there's a host of incompatible stated Russian aims and grievances, but the one I want to kind of focus on, because it's had a certain amount of traction in the West, is the issue of NATO expansion, and this is commonly mentioned as a kind of a cause for the war. There's problems with this argument. The first of these is that the last Russian neighbor to join NATO was in 2004. There have been more recent enlargements, but they're very small scale, very small countries in the Western Balkans. And there were no plans for further enlargement, particularly not to Ukraine and Georgia. These things had been discussed, but in fact, part of the kind of Western diplomatic stance with Russia had been to largely put these off forever. And also the other thing about this is that the NATO drive to enlargement since 1991 has not been driven by Western governments, but largely driven by Central and Eastern European countries. So it's being driven by Russia's neighbors rather than by the West. And there have been as well Russian attempts in the past to reach out to Russia We can think here of the Obama reset, the German resuscitated Ostpolitik, the Trump administration's diplomacy with Russia, and also the way that the West has largely ignored provocations in terms of Russian support, for example, for far-right populist and neo-Nazi organizations in the West. And the irony is, if NATO expansion is the issue for the Russians, then the irony is the invasion may have actually backfired. It's is actually sparking moves for more enlargement. The Central and Eastern European countries have largely drawn the lesson from the invasion of Ukraine that if you want to remain safe, you have to join NATO. Sweden and Finland now, unprecedented, now have majorities, according to the latest opinion polls, who want to join NATO. These are neutral countries. And it's also have increased NATO solidarity, especially in the East. Although it may not actually be, and this is something I'm happy to discuss later on, it may not necessarily be NATO that actually is the Russian worry. The worry actually might be European Union expansion. But that's another issue. I just want to finish off on two last points before I hand over to my colleagues. The first one is to mention also the scale of the refugee crisis. We now have 1.7 million refugees who have left Ukraine in the last fortnight. That's a very short space of time. So it's already in the top 14 worst since 1945, but it's likely to rise. So we have a refugee crisis. And I think the last point that I want to kind of finish on is that from an international relations point of view, what we can see here is that Putin has very much made himself a hostage to fortune in this conflict. And there's no clear way out for the Russian regime. But because of Russia's size, its role in natural resources trade, and its possession of nuclear weapons, he's also made hostages out of the rest of us as well.
Excellent. So do I go ahead now, Luke? Perfect. All right. Okay, so thanks, Andrea and Luke, for organizing this. I have to say, it is a nice change from doom scrolling endless videos of war in Ukraine to actually sit here and take some time to try and think a little bit synthetically about what's going on and what the future holds, although most of it is pretty bleak. My comments today are focused on the question of what is to be done, with a real focus on the issue of economic sanctions and the sort of international political economy dimensions of what's going on here. Given the images coming out of Ukraine and the kind of broad public reaction to them, there's a real desire to do something more than we're doing. And we're seeing calls for more direct action at the moment. Over the weekend, there was a lot of discussion of no-fly zones, which sounds a bit scary to me. But I think we need to slow down and reflect a little bit on the scale of the interventions we in the West are already making in this conflict. According to the French government, we have declared economic war on Russia in a relatively unprecedented way. And open musings about regime change in Russia and bringing the Putin regime down are full of risks that will make this situation even worse than it already is. And so I was going to digress a little bit into a discussion of Robert Jervis's classic perception and misperception here, do some classic IR stuff. But since Luke has already used the drinking our own Kool-Aid metaphor, that Putin is drinking his own Kool-Aid, I'll maybe just say that I think that that's a major part of the story here that we need to talk about sort of on all levels. Of course, there's already been lots of commentary on Putin's own misperceptions surrounding his decision to invade Ukraine and the basic insanity of what he is doing. I mean, Putin has clearly underestimated Ukraine's willingness and capability to resist. This is not the Ukraine of 2014. And the basic substance of that decision just seems bizarre to me. But it's also the case that Putin and many Western governments seem to have failed to anticipate the kind of broad public response around the world, this groundswell of support for Ukraine that has really forced governments in Europe and elsewhere to take a much harder line in terms of both economic sanctions against Russia and military aid to Ukraine. I don't think that the governments involved thought they would be in the place they are now just 10 days ago, let alone 2 weeks ago, in terms of the ways in which we are now retaliating against Russia. And there's real risks that these sanctions and sort of unprecedented economic statecraft are a potentially serious escalation of this conflict. And we haven't even yet seen the full scope of their impact. So I guess just in terms of the economic sanctions, I would say that there is a kind of general idea out there that sanctions aren't effective in response to this kind of aggression. I would say that they are, and in this case, they may almost be too effective, and that we should be careful of how we conceive of them. Some of what is being suggested threatens the very existence of the Putin regime, at least the way I understand that regime. I mean, we really are, in a sense, trying to go after the basic lifeblood of what makes it possible for Putin to maintain his power and influence within the Russian state. And I think, therefore, we need to think carefully about everything we do at this point in terms of the extent to which it could prompt further escalation from a desperate government in very difficult circumstances. And also, in a perverse sense, could actually motivate broader support for the Putin regime in Russian society itself. There's a very real risk of that kind of counter-reaction too. So just a couple of points on the sanctions. The kind of hyper globalization and interdependence that we have now, particularly in the area of supply chains and global financial markets, has made economic statecraft and sanctions far more immediate in their effects than they were in the past. This is not the grindingly slow impact of trade sanctions against the apartheid regime in South Africa or sanctions against Japan before the Second World War. We're now talking about tools that have the ability to turn off large parts of the Russian economy almost overnight. And in a scale and immediacy that is somewhat unprecedented. A lot of observers have been quick to sort of buy into, I think a largely Russian promoted argument that the limited array of sanctions imposed on Russia after the 2014 seizure of Crimea have somehow been ineffective, that they didn't really do anything. But I think the evidence is fairly clear that they have inflicted real pain in Russia. People in Russia, economists, have already been talking openly about a lost decade of economic development in Russia as a response to the 2014 sanctions. I mean, even before this current invasion, the ruble had already declined by 50% in value relative to the sort of benchmark Western currencies. Economic growth has been non-existent in Russia since 2014, and public sector deficits have been really large. It's created an environment where the Russian government already has to borrow, even before this crisis, at very high interest rates. Russian governments were only marginally better than Russian government bonds were only marginally better than junk bond status before this invasion. And all of that has meant less money for the kind of bread and circus antics of Putin's current regime. Less money for public pensions, which are a really important solidifier of support for the regime. Less money to rebuild Crimea. Crimea remains the poorest jurisdiction in the Russian Federation. And crucially, less money to continue Putin's program of modernizing the Russian military, which really ran out of steam after 2014. This is part of the reason why Russia isn't very well prepared for this war, and many of its soldiers are still heavily reliant on Soviet-era equipment. The money just hasn't been there to support Putin's imperial fantasies. In the West, this idea has crept in that these limited sanctions amounted to doing nothing in the face of Russian aggression. But I think the sanctions have kind of done what they were supposed to do. They have denuded the ability of Putin's Russia to make exactly this kind of war. Certainly, they haven't prompted regime change, as we see people musing about now. But that would be setting the bar dangerously high for judging the effectiveness of what sanctions are supposed to do in this case. So fast forward to the last week, governments all over the world have agreed to a much more serious set of sanctions. They've really ratcheted up what states were already doing. And we're talking about a kind of unprecedented economic statecraft that many of us thought might not even have been politically possible. It was once sort of assumed that globalization would reduce the likelihood of exactly this kind of conflict given heightened financial interdependence and supply chains. But again, in part based on arguments promoted by Russia, a lot of people have sort of subsumed the idea that we wouldn't necessarily use these levers because sanctions hurt us as much as they hurt Russia. But I think it's quite apparent that that idea is just wrong. Russia has taken considerable steps since 2014 to try and prepare for further sanctions. They hoarded massive currency reserves. They've tried very hard to increase Europe's dependence on gas exports. But the truth is still the same, that we have considerable capabilities to really disrupt the Russian economy in ways that were unimaginable in the past. And it's not free, but at a relatively low cost to ourselves. No one has a good estimate yet of the impacts of sanctions, in part because a lot of the actions that are being taken at the moment are voluntary. A lot of what's going on at the moment is individual firms are choosing to get out of Russia, essentially over and above what's formally required by the economic restrictions that are being put in place. But I see serious economists kicking around numbers like a 40% contraction in the size of the Russian economy this year alone. I mean, that is an epic economic catastrophe for Russia. So I guess my final point here just returns to this issue about being careful to drink our own Kool-Aid. I think that applies to us as well as it applies to Putin, that we need to be careful to not assume sort of this idea that we're doing nothing and people are still dying in Ukraine and therefore we should take steps towards ever further more rash actions. I think the current situation requires us to be very careful. Just like we need to be careful about talking about no-fly zones, we should be careful about thinking that the purpose of sanctions is to bring down the Putin regime and have governments in the West openly musing about regime change. That's a threat to the Putin administration in a way that could make this situation much worse. So very similar to Luke. Luke says we're in uncharted territory. I'm saying in terms of the economic sanctions, we're already off the map. We don't really know where this is going. We don't know the scope of our economic interventions. It's really tough to not want to go all in on helping Ukraine. I understand the public response, but we may be piling misperception on top of misperception here. And we shouldn't underestimate the impact of the economic actions that we've already undertaken.
Thanks, Russell. And thank you also to the Alumni Affairs for organizing this roundtable today. So while my colleagues have focused and emphasized more the international relations side of it, focusing on treaties, protocols, organizations, and the likes, I'll take this discussion in a slightly different direction, where I'll focus a bit more on the domestic politics and its role in conflict and wars. And specifically, so the things that happen within a country that may change the outcome. A lot of people online and in person have been discussing, well, why is it that, why can't people in Russia stop Putin? Well, I teach a course on political violence and conflict at Memorial, where my students and I get to explore protest, among other things. And the number one factor associated with protesters getting what they want, or protest working, if you will, is the presence of legitimate and charismatic leaders. So leaders who can mobilize masses, credibly speak on their behalf, and keep them united around a specific message. And unfortunately, in authoritarian regimes like Russia and China, state forces are very quick to imprison or even kill anyone who's remotely starting to take a position like this. So that's why Uyghurs and Tibetan descents, or Russian descents as well, are often moving abroad. So without leadership, domestic protests, the kind of domestic protests that we see in Russia, and it's substantial, while they do require a whole lot of courage given the level of state repression, are unlikely to stop the war in Ukraine. Some of you may also say that, well, there's also, on a number of occasions, protests may lead to coup d'etats. Well, coups do occur, and they occur when a government or a political leader gets overthrown and needs to step down. And historically, coups have had a nearly 50-50% chance of succeeding. But here the key is that by succeeding, I don't mean that there's a regime change and that suddenly the new regime is a democratic one. I simply mean that for a coup to be successful, as we understand it, there's a new leader in place. Again, since nearly all coups are organized or led by the military, there is truly no guarantee that Putin's replacement would be any less inclined to fight a war with Ukraine or to use the nuclear weapon as a threat. So by the look of it, it's therefore quite unlikely that political events happening in Russia as of now would be enough to bring a stop to the war in Ukraine. But something that the conflict in Ukraine has made absolutely clear is that wars are no longer won or lost by the military alone. So if you think of World War I, for instance, you can probably picture those images of soldiers fighting in trenches with civilians being somewhat away. Fast forward a few decades and later on the 20th century, we know that civilians have been increasingly involved in wars and conflict, despite the growth in international protocols trying to limit that. But in the Ukraine war, what we've seen is truly a growth in third parties being involved in the conflict. Companies like Facebook and Twitter that have started to mention that they would not permit, they would make sure that Russia would not be allowed to make money out of their sites. Third parties and by this I include individuals like Elon Musk, that has delivered Starlink internet terminals to help Ukrainians remain online despite power outages and internet breakages. But also, and that's perhaps the most controversial, third parties include groups like Anonymous that have been hacking Russian, but also Belarus banks, state broadcasters, and transportation system. So while some people were perhaps quick to cheer at Russian hackers being served some of their own medicine, this also means that we're suddenly normalizing or saying that it's okay for these groups that are not operating or are not bound by any treaties and protocol, to play a key role in armed conflict. Whether this is something we're comfortable with remains to be seen. But what this shows, though, is that in this particular war, although it's been true of many of the previous wars as well, is that technology and social media have played a key role. It's been a key factor for the Ukrainian government, not only for making sure that it can reach external audiences, it can so the fact that they've been able to forge alliances with other states, convincing them to apply pressure and sanctions. But the Ukrainian government has also been able to use social media, for instance, to make videos, to keep morale up for their own troops, to recruit people, to provide, to also emphasize the plight of people in a situation in Ukraine. It's also been extremely useful for Ukrainian people to find information about the latest raid alerts, and also, as I said a little bit earlier, raise awareness about their plight and situation. The international community has also been able to benefit from technology and social media, as it was able to monitor the situation and keep a close eye on whether war crimes are being committed, but also preempt or better allocate resources at border cities. So places like in Romania, Moldova, Hungary, and Poland, where there's been substantial refugee flows. But this is not to say that it has only benefited Ukraine's and its allies, as Russia has also been able to locate people and resources in Ukraine thanks to things like the geolocators apps. So as for many things in politics, nothing is simple or straightforward, as there are many actors involved in this conflict, and they all have very different interests. And while this conflict may resemble others in the past, it also shows a combination of very unique characteristics, which makes it very difficult to predict or attempt to predict what or how it will unfold. And this, of course, can be quite stressful. But I'd like to close the discussion by reminding everyone that war is far from an abstract concept. People are losing jobs, homes, family members in Ukraine, of course, but also in Russia. It's important to realize also that very few people here have chosen to be involved in this war. For pretty much everyone but Putin and its very close allies, people have been forced into it and are now suffering heavily. So as we discuss, let's make sure that we keep that in mind the way we talk about it. So thank you very much.
Great. Thanks, Russell, and thanks, Isabelle. And we have one question that's come through on the chat via the question and answers, but there's also been two quick things that have come through on the chat as well. One's from Carol Lynn. She was asking for recommendations for reliable sources of information on the conflict. So I think that might be a good one to start off with. A difficult one, actually. I don't know if either of you have your own recommendations.
I've been asked about that by students, and it really depends what part of the conflict you're interested in. I think if you're interested in sort of the day-to-day events of the conflict itself, I really appreciate the Institute for the Study of War in the United States, which you can Google Understanding War to find it, which has really good status updates on what's going on inside Ukraine at the moment. I also think the Council for Foreign Relations in the United States is another good sort of semi-independent source of careful analysis. They're putting up talks like this, panel discussions almost every day from recognized experts in this particular area. And I think the level of analysis you'll find there is just much, much better than you'll find by searching the media or spending a lot of time on Twitter like I do.
Isabelle, do you have any recommendations?
In terms of social media, I think that there's been one thing that I found surprising, or that I've, as a part of an external audience, I've really appreciated being able to follow journalists in Ukraine, and there are a number of them on Twitter that remains active on Twitter despite living in a war zone. I'm thinking particularly about the Kiev Independent. They've been doing some really great journalism, and there are a number of their journalists who are located across the country that you can follow as well. But this gives you more of an insight into the everyday changes and attacks and things like that. So if you're interested in other aspects of the conflict, I would have to think about it. Let me think about it, Caroline.
Yeah, I'd just like to add that I've been watching a lot of the Channel 4 news. They have
Always
people on the ground there, including Lindsay Hilsum, who started out in the east and is now working her way. She's reached Odessa now, and she is always very good about being in conflict zones. The other thing, though, is that Channel 4 has continued to interview people in Russia as well, both those pro and anti the war, although some of the ones with the pro-war people have been quite heated. So that's been what I've been finding quite useful. And there's a lot of open source intelligence too, and the best for that is probably Bellingcat, which tries to make a sense of these things. Okay, we've got quite a number of things here. We got I want to to start off first, one question from Christina Koretska of talking about she's talking about the Budapest Memorandum on Security Assurances, but she's particularly interested in the question about what would be the cost of closing the Ukrainian sky to foreign troops. I don't know did you want to answer that one, Russell? Because that's kind of linked with the Western response.
Yeah, so sure. So, I've said this since 2014, I don't think there'll ever be another state that will willingly give up its nuclear weapons. You know, Russia lost in all the discussion of what happened in terms of the peace partnerships with Yeltsin in the early 90s were those much later guarantees in which the United States, Britain, and Russia all guaranteed the territorial sovereignty and integrity of Ukraine in exchange for giving up its nuclear weapons. I think that the lessons here are all too obvious and unfortunately all too sad, right? That this probably would not be happening today if Ukraine had not cooperated with those countries. In terms of direct military assistance, I mean, if we're talking about intensified efforts to get weapons and other kinds of aid to Ukraine, it seems to me that that's already occurring, that a lot of assistance is flowing into Ukraine and will continue to do so. And it really seems like Poland is going to be relatively crucial in that effort, given that it obviously shares the border with Ukraine, and that seems to be the conduit for supplies. But as for flights from NATO countries entering Ukrainian airspace at the moment, I really think that's unlikely, risky, and dangerous under the circumstances. Not simply dangerous to those planes, but dangerous in terms of how it will be interpreted by Russia and the implications of that. So I certainly think we need to do as much as possible to get both humanitarian and military aid to Ukraine under the circumstances. That's clearly part of the Western strategy, is to make Russia pay hard for everything it gets in Ukraine at the moment. And that requires a lot of direct aid from the West in the form of equipment.
We got a question here, and again, I think this one's would also be to Russell. How fragile is the line that will delineate the economic sanctions imposed and the shift? Yeah, how fragile is the line that will delineate the economic sanctions imposed and the shift to a new economic world order?
Yeah, so I saw that question in the questions, and that's a great question. Because I do think the world is being remade at the moment. It's not just about this current conflict. What has been happening in places like Ukraine is, and it relates to your comment about the importance of the EU and EU growth in this, Luke, is that those countries are being realigned economically, right? The center of gravity for the Ukrainian economy before this conflict is increasingly the EU, not Russia. And that's a really important context for what's happening here. Russia is a relatively small economy. It's an economy the size of Canada's. And the extent to which even sort of immediate neighboring countries increasingly throw in their lot economically with the West and with the European Union in particular is clearly part of what's bothering Putin's administration. The extent to which Russia becomes increasingly marginal and isolated just by those forces is important. But what's going to come out of this conflict, I think, is inevitably a relatively complete isolation in which Russia and maybe some of the small frozen conflict states elsewhere and Belarus end up being, you know, a sort of an economic thing, somewhat isolated from the rest of the world in the way that Comintern was isolated from the West during the Cold War. I think what's interesting, and probably Isabelle has far more expertise and comments on this than I do. What's interesting to me is how China reacts to that situation. Is this the moment when China decides to jump and try and build something global and economic in its ambition that centers on China instead of the United States and the EU? Or do they recognize that Russia simply isn't a great partner, and as a result, Russia ends up a very isolated and marginal place in the world in the future, other than the fact they still have their nuclear weapons?
Actually, that's a really good segue, because there's actually, I'll just jump questions and then go back to an earlier one. But there was a question here about, you know, what about the China factor? And, you know, flowing on from what Russell said, Isabelle, did you want to talk about the China?
Sure, I can add a few things. Just this morning, the Chinese government came out saying that the Russia-Chinese friendship was rock solid. So, you know, they're really trying to emphasize the fact that things are swell between the two countries. But it's important to realize, though, that they are really competing also over Central Asia. So in terms of the Belt and Road Initiative, the two large countries are vying for resources in Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, etc. So it's been interesting. So as again, full disclosure, I'm not a specialist of Russia. I'm someone who's more familiar with China, but it's been very interesting how China has not been more vocal in terms of its support for Russia. They've been very lukewarm in terms of the fact that they don't want things to they want a de-escalation of this situation in Ukraine. They're not ever talking about the fact that there's been an invasion or war in a country, and that's of course because China is you know for the Chinese government, national integrity, border like having control over what happens domestically matters tremendously. So they want to make sure that they retain control over Tibet, they retain control over Xinjiang, and so anything like what's happening in Ukraine can quickly unravel in China. So it's been my take home message so far has been that despite those big messages about solid friendship and everything, there hasn't been a lot of actual actions showing support from the Chinese government to the Russian government. So I guess we shall see in the coming weeks.
We have another quick question here, and it's from something that happened today. Russia, a no-show at the UN court hearings on Ukraine invasion. What does the panel make of this headline?
I don't know if you have thoughts on that, Luke. All I'll say here is the arm of international law is longer than it has ever been in the past, and Russia is undoubtedly committing war crimes in Ukraine right now, and I guarantee people will go to jail eventually for this. It may take 20 years, it may take a long time, but much like the tribunals that handled war crimes in the wars and the breakup of Yugoslavia, they got the guilty in the end. And so, I don't expect it to have much of an impact on the Putin regime, but the generals making these calls at the moment right now in Russia, be warned. The future is bleak for you.
Did you want to add anything to Isabelle to that? No? Yeah, I mean, my only feeling on this at this stage, and this is all very new information, and this is part of the problem for us, is that we're taking in all of this new information and trying to make sense of it. But my hot take on this one is it really does underscore Russia's continuing isolation from the global community, and we saw that with the UN vote too, where only 5 countries actually supported Russia there. There were a lot of abstentions, but it's when countries like China abstain, that itself is actually can be interpreted as a guarded criticism of Russia. We have another question here. The humanitarian situation is obvious and visible. Many of us have grown with the mantra of if you see wrong being done, then standing by to observe is not enough. Thoughts and prayers are empty. Do you surmise that if Putin gains control of Ukraine, that it will be his Sudetenland and there would be more to come? So, the 1938 analogy.
The 1930s are your territory, Luke.
Yeah, well, in that sense, I would say that one big difference there, I suppose. I mean, there is a certain, history doesn't repeat, it rhymes, and there is a certain rhyming here, is that the West takes a long time to get its act together on things, but when it does, it's pretty dramatic. So I suppose what I would say on this is that no, this is not really a Sudetenland. I don't want to keep with the World War II analogies, but what I would say is that I think actually what we're seeing is a turning point in Western actions and Western reactions. It's been building for a long time against Russia, but also I think reactions within Central and Eastern Europe as well. I think this is kind of there's a lot of I told you so's going on now in Central and Eastern Europe as well as in Ukraine. There's another one here. Hi, what are the long-term dangers of weaponizing? It's one for you there, Russell. What are the long-term dangers of weaponizing financial instruments, especially given that many of these instruments are controlled not by elected officials, but banks and private corporations?
Wow, yeah. So I think that that's a really big question too, and I just don't think we really know yet what the implications of that are going to be. I think that what this illustrates is a kind of, I mean, the world has been in a place of cognitive dissonance for a while, in that we have been building this integrated, largely privately run global economy in which we all participate at the same time as geopolitics have been kind of driving us apart. And I really see this conflict as being kind of a working out of that dissonance in real time. I'm not sure what the long-term implications are more broadly for the world, but I think obviously Russia is going to kind of be excluded from globalization and the global economy in some real ways for the foreseeable future. And I think that there is a powerful lesson in that for other states that think they can participate in that global liberal order without abiding by the responsibilities and rules of that order. And Russia's sort of learning at the moment you can't have it both ways. And so, yeah, I think that's where we're at.
Yeah, great. Do you want to add anything, Isabelle? Yeah.
Yeah, if it's okay. Some of you may remember that truly early on in when there were discussions of the first round of economic sanctions, Italy came out saying that they had finally agreed to the economic sanction, but they had lobbied hard to make sure that luxury goods were not included to the list of sanctions. But it's been really interesting because today, several quote unquote luxury brands were saying that they were stopping productions in Ukraine, in Russia. So so you see that there is a back and forth between companies that simply find it unsustainable and very morally questionable to continue their operation in Russia. So while they were initially, the lobbies were made sure that they would be protected from sanctions, they actually ended up retracting their operation or scaling back their operation in Russia simply because it was not, it was just a wrong thing to do, or continuing operating was a wrong thing to do. So it's economic sanctions are truly, even as a non-expert, this is something that is in motion and that is changing very rapidly.
We have a question here saying intellectuals from around the world have been warning about this crisis since at least 2014. Why has Canada and even the UN General Assembly not advocated for Ukraine having neutral military status, much like its neighbor Moldova? I don't know if either of you have...
Yeah, so a couple of different ideas in that question. So I would say that one of the really important dimensions of this current conflict is process related. The fact that events have to unfold in an order in which people are primed and ready to understand the full scope of what's going on. I think in 2014, the rapid seizure of Crimea, the sort of, what was by no means bloodless, but I think that the West wasn't ready. The public in the West wasn't really ready to see that as the scale of the crisis in which they're ready to see it now. Essentially, because of the seizures in 2014, the invasion in 2014, people have been primed and are ready to see Russian aggression for what it is. And so I think, as is the case in a lot of conflicts, the problem here is that Russia's a repeat offender. And that's why there has been this broad public reaction in a way that I think even a lot of governments in the West failed to anticipate. So to the extent that Western governments didn't do more after 2014, I think they just weren't ready to do more at that point. Sometimes you have to be told something more than once before it takes. And Russia has now illustrated what it's doing enough times that I think Western governments are now ready.
Isabelle, do you? Anything to add on that? There's a set of two questions that I can run together, I think, and I think they're directed at me. One is, yeah, if this war is not about Ukraine potentially joining NATO, what factors can we identify as causes of this war? And the other one is, why might Putin be more concerned about the European Union than about NATO? And I think the bottom line here is that in terms of sort of Russia's desire to kind of create a sphere of influence in its near abroad, it's actually more directly in competition with what the European Union has been doing, in the sense that it's through the European Union that the two of the things that are most attractive to being more integrated with Europe show up. One of them is prosperity, and one of them is democratization. And I think these are two key ones. And if you look back, of course, to 2014 and the overthrow of Yanukovych in Ukraine, it's the spark for that was Yanukovych refusing to sign an agreement with the European Union. So I think this is a major concern, and this is where it's the attraction of the European Union that is one of the pull factors that's pulling Russia's neighbors to wanting to have more associations with the West, and it tends to be with Europe rather than with North America or the sort of wider North Atlantic space. So I think that's I think that's the concern, but I think it's something that it's more difficult to make a claim if you're Russia that is the problem, which I think is why NATO quite often gets used as a kind of a surrogate for that. NATO appears to be more prickly and more dangerous than the European Union in terms of propaganda. But there's one here, I think, for Isabelle here, related, as is also another question from Barry. If social media has the power to determine the fate of nations, what are the implications of those tools being in private hands?
I know, huh? It's a concerning one, to say the least, because we know, they're not quite the normal actors in war, and so yeah, it's something that I'm definitely concerned about as well. And unfortunately, Barry, I don't really have an answer. But if I may, I see there's one question from Karen asking about whether there are reliable stats on Russian support for the invasion and for Putin in general. And of course, things change very rapidly. But I remember a survey that was done last week by a Russian-sponsored firm, and that showed that there was 67% support for something. If I'll loosely say that it was something about, like, do you support the special operation in Ukraine in order to promote the defensive interest of Russia and to support it was very, massage, let's just say. Like, the question was very unclear. So much so, in fact, that someone on social media said, if you ask someone, do you like Brussels sprouts? Of course, they'll say no. But if you say, do you like organic, blooms from the soil, and there's a way to make anything be a lot more appealing than it is. So, unfortunately, that's the only one that comes to mind in terms any kind of survey or figures that has come to mind in terms of the support. But considering the high risk that Russian citizens run when they go in the streets and protest, the fact that even during this weekend, after protests have been banned in the country, there's still been close to 2,000 arrests. This shows you that, at the very least, this is not, not everyone supports the war, and that some people are even willing to risk a fair bit in order to make sure that Putin hears it or sees that there is dissent.
I see we're kind of running out of time here, but there's one short question here that I don't think there's a short answer to, but it's worth throwing out, I think, and nicely caps off the discussion, I think. Is there still a way out for Putin in this mess? What would peace look like?
So I don't think there's a way out for Putin that involves peace, and that's why this crisis is horrific, as horrific as it is. I do think there is a path to the end of this conflict, but that really comes from Russia not being able to win the war, which is clearly what the intention in the West is. It's scary, and I'll just say it bluntly. I mean, the strategy in Washington or at NATO headquarters here is to make this war as difficult as possible for Russia, to denude the Russian army of the ability to fight, to inflict huge economic pain on Russia, and hope that somehow that manifests itself with Russia deciding to rethink what it's doing here. I find it very hard to see that there's any way that Putin can accept a defeat in this conflict and continue in office. So, I mean, personally, as horrific as it is, I expect this to be a very long and awful conflict, primarily borne by the people of Ukraine.
Isabelle?
Unfortunately, I think that Russell, I think you're correct that this is, and just the fact that violence has escalated in recent days shows that sometimes we say that leaders at the very when they see that options and the possibility of victory is becoming slimmer and slimmer, that one way you can keep I'm looking for my words here. One way to not win, but at least not lose your, what's the word I'm looking for? Your reputation, I guess, is that you start blanket bombing and you start trying to create as much misery as possible. And so truly this is not a good situation. And save face, thank you. Yes,
Safe, yes.
George Shepard. George Shepard sent me a private message. That's precisely what I was looking for. I appreciate it. I'm gracefully bowed. That's it. Thank you for reading my mind.
So
but yeah, it's a challenging one for sure. Sorry, go ahead, Russell.
I do think that's why so many observers in the West, so many experts on international politics and military affairs are spending so much time micro-focused on what's wrong with the Russian army. And that's a product of a kind of wishful thinking, right? That we are desperately hoping that the Russian army just is really this bad, and that what the pathway to peace here is for Ukraine to win, essentially. But that will come at a horrific cost to Ukraine.
Yeah, I think I just to add to that my hope is a fast and speedy diplomatic end to this. But for that to happen, it would require some kind of face saving for the Russian Federation government. And at the moment, there is very little prospect for that. So I hope for the best, prepare for the worst. Okay, over to you, Andrea.
Thank
That was
you.
This was a bleak way to end.
And I'm sorry to cut the conversation off. We have so many questions that you all can probably see as I was channeling them and trying to condense them a bit. There's so many questions, and I would like to sincerely thank our panelists today, Doctors Ashworth, Williams, and Côté, for sharing their time and expertise with us. Your words have helped us gain a better understanding of this difficult time in history. So we thank all of you out there for attending and for your very thoughtful questions, and we apologize that we just don't have enough time to get through all of them today. So as indicated earlier, the session has been recorded and you will be receiving a link via email. Just a few notes about our upcoming alumni events. On March the 9th, Coastline's Book Club event with author Amy Wall. March 15th, we have a Munalum 101 on ageism. And on the 29th, managing medication. So check out www.mun.ca/alumni. On behalf of the Office of Alumni Engagement, we thank you again for joining us. Please support Ukraine through learning about their country and history, and remember to remain hopeful. Thank you.